Buenos días a todas. Johanna Cantola y Manuela Lombardo, en su último libro publicado ahora hace un par de meses, Género y crisis económica en Europa, políticas, instituciones e interseccionalidad, afirman que las políticas de género en la Unión Europea no viven buenos tiempos. Muestran el impacto de la austeridad, cómo el impacto de la austeridad ha comportado recortes de las políticas y las estructuras de género, de las de ocupación, de los derechos y de los servicios públicos. Todo ello ha contribuido al aumento de la desocupación de las mujeres, de su pobreza, de las cargas y de las discriminaciones que sufrimos. La situación está siendo especialmente dura para las más vulnerables, las de origen diverso, las LGTBI, las jóvenes y las viudas o las mujeres con diversidad funcional. Además, afirman en su libro que al duro contexto económico hay que añadirle una fuerte ola de conservadurismo, un proceso de desdemocratización que adopta nuevas y antiguas formas, como son el retorno de las mujeres al hogar, el incremento de las violencias machistas, el ataque al derecho a abortar o el racismo. En esta coyuntura crítica que nos explican, las actuaciones desde los gobiernos locales devienen complejas y necesarias. La misma forma de construir el relato sobre las crisis modula también las políticas que se llevan a cabo, invisibilizando, aumentando o disminuyendo las desigualdades de género en nuestras ciudades. Cantola alerta sobre poner el acento en una igualdad de género que sea reactiva, individualizada y tan solo centrada en políticas de antidiscriminación. Las iniciativas de avance, por contra, pasan por hacer actuaciones proactivas, de empoderamiento, comunitarias y preventivas, utilizando acciones positivas y la transversalidad de género. Seguro que ahora escucharemos propuestas que podremos plantear desde el Ayuntamiento de Barcelona, esta acción institucional que pueda contribuir a la justicia de género. A pesar de los retos de la austeridad, en el libro también se apunta la importancia de las luchas ciudadanas en nuestro contexto. El feminismo y otros movimientos sociales se han revitalizado en los últimos tiempos con nuevos planteamientos que quieren darle un vuelco a las injusticias. La última parte del título de nuestra jornada trata exactamente de eso. Queremos mostrar estas luchas y escuchar las demandas y las reivindicaciones que crecen en Barcelona y en otros puntos del Estado y de Europa, tanto en la esfera productiva como en la reproductiva, en la macro y en la microeconomía. Queremos que esta jornada también pueda ser un altavoz para esas voces. Y ahora tenemos la suerte de poder contar con la voz de Johanna Cantola, que nos hablará sobre género y políticas de la crisis económica en Europa. Johanna Cantola es doctora e investigadora del Grupo de Investigación en Estudios de Género del Departamento de Filosofía, Historia, Cultura y Arte de la Universidad de Helsinki, donde también es profesora titular de Estudios de Género, y es la directora de la Academia de Finlandia y del Fondo de Investigación de su universidad. Sus principales líneas de investigación son el género, el poder y la política, los partidos políticos y las instituciones, y también cuestiones teóricas sobre el Estado, la representación y la interseccionalidad. Entre sus últimas publicaciones destacan Gender and Political Analysis, que también acaba de salir publicado junto con Emanuela Lombardo, y es coeditora del Oxford Handbook on Gender and Politics, y del que para nosotras también es un clásico ya, Feminists Theorize the State. Cuando quieras, Johanna, gracias.
Yes, there it is. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. I think that's my kind of strongest emotion at the moment. I'll be talking here as an academic and about the book that Sonia kindly already introduced briefly. But for me personally, it's very exciting to be in Barcelona for the reasons that we have heard about already. So I think as much as to talk to you about the book today, I'm here to learn. I'm really looking forward to the conversations. And when I was coming here from Helsinki and telling my colleagues that I'm going to Barcelona, I was trying to convey this excitement, the opportunity to really go where things are happening. And I'll talk to you towards the end of the presentation. I'll talk to you a bit about Finland, which is actually quite depressing at the moment. So I'll start. Here's the book. And as you know, academic research always comes a bit behind, yeah? But hopefully, although we are not able to kind of put into words what's happening, all the exciting things that are happening right at this moment, hopefully we can provide some broader frameworks about how to understand and conceptualize and where should we perhaps be looking when we are looking at gender and the economic crisis in Europe. We have very local responses and local manifestations of the crisis, but then we also have some broader trends. So I hope to be talking about the broader trends today. And one of them has to do with gender. Like, how do we understand gender? What are we talking about when we talk about gender? And this is the first point that I want to make now and that we make in the book, in the introduction to the book. So I think we've been quite good at talking about women and the crisis. Yeah, we already heard a bit about the differentiated impact that the economic crisis and the austerity politics is having on women and men. And this is an important aspect. But in terms of research and also our response to the crisis, we of course have to look at some other levels as well, different ways to conceptualize gender. So when women and the crisis is the first dimension, we also have to look at gender and the crisis, which is quite self-evident in terms of gender studies and what we have learned. So we need to understand the underlying structures. So already in the opening, we heard that we can put wonderful new feminist people into institutions, but the institutions resist. We have the underlying gender structures. And also in terms of the crisis, when we talk about gender and the crisis, when we start to look at the gendered structures that underpin the institutions, and we are seeing that the gender regimes can resist either positive change or they can make austerity politics worse. So what I'm talking about here is, for example, if we take the example of Finland, which has had quite a progressive gender regime in terms of care policies and labor market policies, we've had very high employment rates of women, we've had very good care policies. So if we look at gender and the crisis, what we are seeing now in Finland is a shift to a worse gender regime, to a more conservative gender regime. And I think you're seeing Emanuela Lombardo has written a chapter about Spain to the book. So I think you can see some similar shifts here as well. So this is the second dimension in terms of gender theory that we should be looking at. But I also have some others. The third one is about deconstruction. When we kind of challenge this whole idea about women and men, and we challenge the whole idea about the crisis and the dominant ways and the dominant solutions that we are offered. So this is the third dimension. But what's been very important for us, and what I really admire here as well, is the emphasis placed on intersectionality and the crisis. So the way in which the impact of the crisis has been very differentiated on the basis of women's and men's, not just gender and the gender roles, but also race and ethnicity, disability, sexuality and class. And this is something that we asked all of the authors in this book to really pay attention to in the different countries. Finally, I just wanted to mention the fifth dimension. This is something quite academic, but I think you can realize its significance when I explain it a bit. So Emanuela and I, we have been interested in this dimension of post-deconstruction. And what I mean here is that we should focus on emotions and effects and how they are gendered and how they actually underpin our response to the crisis. So here you have Indignados. You had really kind of social movements that were based on this idea that private shame was turned into public anger. So you can see how it moved people. But it's as relevant when you think of Trump, who has also been mentioned, and Brexit. And I think that actually feminist theory and feminist academic studies in politics are really left behind here to understand the emotions and the effects that actually move people in the response to the crisis. So I just mentioned it to you as something that we should be paying attention to that we are maybe not doing. The second key point about the book is that it's about politics. I'm now based in a gender studies department, but I'm a political scientist, and Emanuela Lombardo is as well. And there has been a lot of really good research by feminist economists about gender and the crisis and its gendered impact. But there has been very little about the way that economy and politics go hand in hand and their relationship. And we argue that it's very relevant. And in this book, we want to ask these three questions in relation to gender, the economic crisis, and its political dimension. We try to politicize the crisis in this way, not just talk about economics, which for us is also about politics, obviously, but which tends to push politics away. I think we see a lot of in Europe, a lot of pushing away of politics. So in many countries, like in Finland, maybe less so in Spain, but in Finland there's this tendency to say that it's about economics, and this is why feminism or politics shouldn't enter it. So these are the three kinds of questions that we ask in relation to the political dimension of the crisis. So the first concerns the European Union that Sonja already mentioned. So the European Union has been so important to gender equality policy in many European countries. We can be critical of the EU, we can be critical of its economic policy, but there has been a time when its gender policy was very important. Also to countries like the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, which have been advanced in terms of gender policy. But in this book, and I will talk a bit about it in my next slide, we see this stagnation in the institutions and in the policy. So this is the first question that we ask in the book, and we have quite many chapters about the EU, and we really want to get at how the EU gender policy is going down or is stagnating. Second, we ask questions about the interaction between the European Union and the member states, Europeanization. What is the impact of the European Union on the member states, and not just top down, but also bottom up? So what's happening in terms of this relationship, and what's the impact on the member states? So that's the second part of the book. And when you look at politics and the crisis, then you obviously get at these struggles, the civil society struggles, the feminist struggles against austerity politics. So we ask about the feminist strategies of mobilization against the neoliberal, conservative and racist policies that we are seeing in Europe today. So these are the three questions that we pose to ourselves and to the authors of the book. And I'll now look at some of the answers that we provide in relation to these three. So first, institutional and policy changes in the EU. So it's quite undeniable, and I won't go into the details of the gendered impact of the austerity politics. And these have been really well illustrated and demonstrated by feminist economists. And we have the facts, and we have the very moving stories from different countries. In everything from Ireland to Greece and to Spain, how the austerity politics has made women and minorities suffer in particular, and has been detrimental to their lives. And when we look at the EU, I'm not going to go into the details of the macroeconomic policy-making mechanisms that have been put into place, but I just wanted to list them to you there to remind you of the broadness and kind of the expansive nature of this. So we have the Europe 2020, the Euro Plus Pact, the Stability and Growth Pact, the Fiscal Compact, and the Six Pack. And these are all, there's some wonderful feminist research also about the language that these instruments imply. So if you think of the Six Pack, which is the English term for men's, if you have a lot of muscles, you have a six pack here. So some of the language is very gendered as such. But more importantly, these tools increase the surveillance and sanctions on member states. So in some of my more activist work in Finland, I'm part of the this association, Women's Association, which brings together all the political parties' women's associations and the Gender Studies Association and some of the autonomous feminist movements. It's a roof organization that represents the Finnish women's movements in the European Women's Lobby. And the European Women's Lobby has told us to follow, for example, the European semester, which is one of these macroeconomic tools, where the countries, I don't know how familiar you are with it, but every year the countries report to the European Commission about their progress in relation to these fields and get guidelines about what should be done. And it's a primary example where states and the member states and the European Commission are failing to take any gender mainstreaming action. So the European Women's Lobby told us to keep our eyes open as a women's organization and a women's movement actor, and to insert knowledge into this economic decision-making progress. But it's virtually impossible to follow. So we know the timetable, we know when everything happens, when Finland reports to the Commission and when papers come back, but it's anyway very difficult to have an impact as a women's movement actor. So this is the second point here. These tools are highly undemocratic. It's very difficult to hold the Commission or our government accountable to these tools and to insert the gender knowledge into this. And they are in trouble themselves. Obviously, in terms of politics and democratic decision-making, the role of the governments is narrowed down when you have this economic surveillance from top down. So when we look at gender more specifically in relation to these European institutions and European policymaking, so we see that there are no gender equality goals, and there's this general lack of gender mainstreaming, which is really worrying and which is very depressing for all of us who have been doing work and who have been researching gender mainstreaming for the past 15 years. And we see its disappearance from the European agenda with the crisis and with austerity policy. And this is related to several trends that are specific to EU gender policy. And not all of them are related to the crisis as such, but they work together to make the impact worse for gender equality. And the first that we discuss in the book, in many of the chapters, is this trend towards a stagnation of EU gender policy in relation to all of its dimensions. So if you think of law, you think of anti-discrimination law and policy. We haven't seen very many directives come out recently. And this is obviously related to the current Commission and its desire to reduce the number of directives that the Commission is putting forward. So we see stagnation there. We see stagnation in gender mainstreaming, as I mentioned, but also in a lot of the funding instruments, the money and the programs that have been so important to gender equality. So the Commission always used to have this framework, let's say 5-year framework strategy for gender equality, a positive action program for gender equality. But also these tools have been watered down. So the latest one is no longer a strategy for gender equality. It's just an internal communication for how the Commission should work. This is a small example about what's going on in the European Union. And in addition to this, we see a shift in the whole model. So I mentioned that, at least in my opinion, there have been good times in EU gender policy. And a lot of good feminist activists, femocrats, the people working within the Commission, feminist parliamentarians, they have been really working towards a good gender policy. But now we see a shift in this model. So when it used to be more about kind of employment policy, gender was related to employment and a bit to social rights and social policy. Now we see a shift to this rights model. Yeah. So, for example, gender equality unit was moved within the Commission from the employment DG to this justice DG. It changed the focus of the gender policy. So exactly at the time when we have the economic crisis and we should be talking about poverty and gender feminization of poverty, we should be talking about social rights, we should be talking about employment and social policy in general. We have the EU's gender policy moved to a place that deals with law and rights and anti-discrimination, which is very important as such, but might not be the most efficient tool at this moment. So there is this new priority given to this rights model. And we have this reactive response as a result. Not proactive policy, but reacting to some of the breaches in the rights that we are seeing. So I already also mentioned this issue about intersectionality. So one of the points that we make in the book is to ask, a crisis for whom? Also, we need to take a critical perspective on all the talk about the economic crisis. It's a fact, but if we look at it from the perspective of minority women, we might realize that many live in a permanent state of the crisis. It may not be anything new to them. So we might be prioritizing certain experiences about the crisis, at least in Finland, when we see that something exceptional is going on. And we might not understand that many people have lived in constant precarious situations for much longer. So we need to understand the existing hierarchies and inequalities as well. And on the whole, when we look at the European Union and everything that I have said, and we see this invisibility of gender, we see the crisis, we see kind of institutional changes in the European Union. So we see that it's normatively a very challenging moment for feminists and feminist activists at the EU level. So this is some of our work on the European Union. It's not a very bright picture, I'm afraid. I personally, when I started to talk about this more in 2015, when things started to become very visible and very clear. So I used to be very depressed whenever I went to conferences and I had to talk about the EU gender policy. And obviously now we have the context of Brexit and the rise in radical right populism in many parts of the European Union. So you kind of you feel quite bad making this explicit, but I think we have to we have to first understand the conditions and what should be changed and we should struggle for to really reform some of the European institutions and to recapture the ground that we maybe once had. So if we look at then the member state level, the interaction between the European Union and the member state level across the European Union, this was our second dimension about how to understand the politics of the economic crisis in Europe. So when we talk about the impact of the European Union and Europeanization, we have to understand that it can be either hard, it can be based on the hard law, the directives that have to be implemented in the member states, or some of these macroeconomic steering mechanisms that are quite hard and put pressure on member states. But in relation to gender policy, as important is the soft part of the Europeanization. The transfer of norms and this kind of mutual learning that shifts the ground for gender policy. And because of these different dimensions of Europeanization, we can have one EU policy, but we see a different impact on member states. The member states can go into diverse directions. They can either converge or diverge. And here the national gender regimes are quite important. And the countries that we discuss in the book, I mentioned them here. So from the south of Europe, we have, for example, Spain and Portugal. We have the UK and a bit about France. And we have Ireland, we have Poland and Finland. And actually including Poland and Finland into this picture was quite exciting. Poland has not suffered from the economic crisis to the same extent that many other member states have. But they have self-imposed the EU's mechanisms on them with very similar results that we see in some of the harder hit countries. And we see a bit similar discussion in Finland. So we really see some political usage of the European Union in terms of gender and the economic crisis. And just to give you some examples. So, for example, very much like in Spain, in Ireland, there has been the economic crisis has resulted in a major housing crisis and a crisis of the welfare services as a result of the EU requirements. And we see increase in women's poverty, deterioration in housing conditions, and lack of state support for care and social benefits. And Stefanie Wöhrl, she's a scholar from Austria, and she works on the European Union and Ireland. So in her chapter, she makes a very strong argument based on the Irish case against the EU macroeconomic policy mechanisms. And I already mentioned Poland, which is a very fascinating case and chapter, where you see the political ideology, the very conservative political ideology of the government to interact with the EU's neoliberal austerity policy. And you see the voluntary implementation of austerity politics despite the economy's good performance. You see how the EU policy becomes an excuse for other type of policy, privatization and liberalization. And in the chapter on Poland, we see a really serious watering down about attempts to make it more possible for women and men to combine working hours and care responsibilities. So we see a framing, a liberation of working hours, and we see an argument that this makes it easier to combine work and your care responsibilities. But actually, it's informed by a very liberal, neoliberal ideology that actually led into extending the working hours of all workers. So a very detrimental impact in Poland. Portugal. In Spain, you might know a lot more about it than I do. The chapter is authored by Ana Prata, who is based in the US, but she's Portuguese and comes from Portugal. So again, we see the very gendered impact of the economic crisis that we are already familiar with, also in relation to Spain, for example, and Finland. And we see that it's affected both women's and men's employment, but we see again very strong gender disparities that were mentioned here as well by the previous speaker. So gender disparities in pay, in part-time and fixed contract work, which is a women's problem especially, and this conservative return to traditional gender roles. And in her chapter, Ana Prata, she's interested in the political debate, the parliamentary debate around these issues. And she can show that gender equality and women are hardly mentioned in the Portuguese parliamentary debates, despite this centrality of the gendered impact of the crisis. So I think what's for political scientists, I think it's easy to see neoliberalism as a political project. We had better times in the European Union, and we had neoliberalism then as well. I think it's quite many of us would argue that the European Union's economic policy has for a long time been based on neoliberalism. But its Europeanization was based more on consent by the governments and the member states. But now, with the economic crisis, we see more coercion. It's become more compulsory, and some of its elements have become a lot worse from the point of view of women. And we see this interaction with other political projects, such as conservatism and racism in particular. So, still a bit depressing, but now we maybe get to the more positive part. When we look at it's not so gloomy, and we really see this both tensions and possibilities for feminist struggles, which is really the theme of today as well. So, on the one hand, feminism can kind of easily become co-opted to the economic crisis and to neoliberalism. So here I mentioned this one term. I think we've had many terms associated with feminism. I have myself written about market feminism. So as opposed to state feminism, which used the state to advance gender equality, maybe over the past years, we saw more and more forms of market feminism, which try to use the market in a neoliberal way to advance gender equality. So one of my colleagues, Penny Griffin, talks about crisis governance feminism. So a form of feminism, feminist activism, that tries to gender mainstream very bad policies. So we see some of this in Finland. So, and I must say that I may have been guilty of this myself. So we've tried to, when austerity politics came to Finland very severely, first in 2013, so a lot later than to many other European countries, and then it came a lot stronger in 2015. So us academics, we organized a really big campaign and a very effective campaign where we were joined by all the male professors from different fields of science. It was a very expansive and a big thing. And we called for gender mainstreaming the government's austerity program. So it may have been an example of this. Feminism and feminist activism providing legitimacy to austerity measures. It was a strategic move on our part, and we had this naive belief at that point to the government that if we were and because we were able to illustrate how bad their government program was for low-paid women. Low-paid women were particularly hard targeted. So we had this naive belief that this knowledge and this information would make a difference if they would undertake a gender impact assessment of their government program. They did, but it didn't make any difference. So this is just to illustrate my point that we might have instead made it more legitimate for the government to be doing what they were doing, because they could say that, well, look, these people were saying that gender mainstreaming is important and we did it, and here we go anyway with our austerity politics. So this is one part of the tensions that we might see. But the other part is really this strengthening of feminist movements across Europe. And Spain is, of course, a good example, but also Nordic countries. So, for example, in the Nordic countries, I don't know if you have followed very closely, but there has been this wave to establish feminist parties, political parties. So Sweden was the first, and now they have their feminist MEP, feminist member of European Parliament, Soraya Post, whose background is actually Roma. So it's a very, she really kind of embodies intersectionality. And now we have a feminist party in Finland and Norway as well. So we see also in the Nordic countries, we see this, it's debatable whether it's a movement any longer when it's a political party, but also the roots of these parties, especially in Finland, it's really in the civil society and really in the anger towards increasing racism and this austerity politics. So this is the positive, some of the positive side. But if we go back to the European Union for a moment, so we can have this strengthening of feminist activism on the member state level, and especially kind of the city level and local level. But I just ask us to, for a moment, to consider what's going on at the EU level, because that's important as well. So I'm afraid that the story is not so positive once again. So we have a chapter by Rosalind Gavahan, and she's interviewed some of the femocrats who work for the European Commission. And her chapter has very detailed descriptions about the difficulties that they've had in engaging with macroeconomic policy and how there's this wall in terms of the feminist language and the macroeconomic policy. And she really illustrates that it's also that the femocrats are also maybe blaming themselves or talking about this lack of expertise in economic questions that's making it very difficult. So, for example, even if we ourselves would have quite an expansive notion of economics, and we would argue that care is part of the economy and it's important, we might not have the language and the tools to convey it to the experts at the Commission level. And we also see this in gender and politics scholarship. We have attributed some of the successes of the EU gender policy to this velvet triangle of feminist activism in the EU. So the triangle has meant that the femocrats, the activists, for example, the European Women's Lobby, and the academics have cooperated very closely in this velvet triangle to influence the policy. So in the chapters of the book, we show a weakening of this triangle because of the reduced resources and this difficulty that the austerity politics and the difficulty in talking about economics is resulting in. So this is the EU level. So in terms of the questions about intersectionality and minority women, and I mentioned that it was an important topic for us. So, and actually, I think I already made this point, so I'll just say it very quickly. So we see that minority women's struggles have been made harder in many ways. So many of the discussions that we tend to have about the economic crisis, and I think especially in many of the Northern European countries where intersectionality has not been such an important issue for the women's movement, this is very evident, that the voices and the experiences of the minority women are a lot sidelined. And yet, at the same time, this minority women's perspective would challenge this idea about the exceptionalism of the crisis. And then combined with this, in many European countries, as a result of the Brexit, as a result of austerity politics, we really see an increase in overt racism. So I think we've had institutional racism all the time, and we've had racism all the time, but it's become more overt. It's more on the surface. For example, in Britain and in Finland. So I have one more, my nearly final slide. I promised to Sonia that I'll be very Finnish and very punctual and make sure that we finish this session by 11. So I'll try to stick to that. But I just wanted to say a few words about Finland. As I come from Finland, and my perspective is, of course, influenced by the Finnish policy. So I've realized when I go to different countries in Europe, not many people understand that Finland as well, very differently, for example, from Sweden, has been very deep in the economic crisis. And we've really had this quite harsh austerity politics in 2015 and 2016. And it's a bit debatable whether we would have needed it objectively. But again, we see this kind of ideology of the government, a very conservative right and right populist, because our right populist party, the True Finns, is in the government. So we see this desire to implement austerity politics in Finland. And I just wanted to mention some of its impacts. So if we look at neoliberalism as part of this austerity politics, so we really see that women in low-paid jobs have suffered most. So the government has implemented measures where there's virtually been a transfer from low-paid women in terms of their salary. They have voluntarily cut down their salary, given up their holiday pay benefits, and extended their working hours. And there's been this massive transfer of money and benefits to companies and to employers. It's because of our cooperative system. We are a cooperative country where the employees and employers and the state negotiate in cooperative procedures. So this is what they manage to push on us. And also quite strikingly, I don't know if any of the European newspapers are writing about it, but the government is privatizing our healthcare. So we've obviously, as a welfare state, we've had a completely public healthcare system, like the Britain, for example, has the NHS, their kind of pride, part of their pride. So the government is currently very quickly privatizing this. So they are shifting power. This is taken away from municipalities, who are currently the providers of healthcare. So they lose maybe over 50% of the budget is taken away because healthcare is taken away. It's moved to one level up. They are creating a new kind of a structure. And also the public providers of healthcare have to become companies and compete in the market. It's quite shocking in terms of women's jobs. Obviously, the municipalities and the healthcare sector mainly employ women. So it's going to have very severe consequences for women's jobs and also for women as users of these services. So, and it's being pushed through very hastily. The timetable, it's incredible. I can talk more about it if you want, but But we also see this, how I mentioned that these other political projects are important as well. So it's not just neoliberalism and kind of the rationality of the economy that's driving this. It's also the conservatism of the government. So we have very conservative parties in power. And as a result, they have done away with our other cornerstone of the women-friendly welfare state, which has been the statutory right to childcare. So every child under the age of 7 has had the statutory right to public childcare in Finland. And it's really made women's labour market participation possible. It's been the key to it. So the government has now dismantled this. And children whose parents are freelance, unemployed students in atypical work contracts only have the right to 20 hours of childcare. It used to be full-time 40 hours. So now it's reduced, and it's had very bad repercussions on these children for many reasons, and also for women, because seeking a job can be a full-time job. My partner is a freelancer, so we wouldn't be entitled to full-time childcare any longer unless we lived in Helsinki, which is an example of a city who has resisted and has decided not to implement the government policy. So we see this divergence between different cities. It depends on which part of Finland you come from, whether you have good gender equality policies or not. So if I still lived in northern Finland, in my hometown, the position of my own family would be a lot worse. And then combined with this, we have this nationalism and this increased racism as a result of the right populist party, the True Finns, being in the government that I already mentioned. And I mentioned velvet triangles in relation to feminist activism. So me and my colleague in this book and in our other work, we've been now interested in this kind of this iron triangle of neoliberalism, conservatism, and nationalism, and its impact on feminist activism, and how difficult as a feminist activist it is to engage this whole triangle where everything has an impact on everything. So that's my final point, and I'll finish here to leave some time for questions. Thank you.
Como decía, thanks a lot for your inspiring keynote. Como decía Johanna, vamos a tener unos pocos minutos antes de la siguiente mesa para preguntas. Hacemos un turno cerrado, tenemos a las compañeras del CIRT con micros y aprovecho para agradecerles todo el esfuerzo y el trabajo y la dedicación para la organización de estas jornadas.
Hola, ¿se siente? ¿Se oye? Sí. Hola, soy María Montesinos de la Fundación Indera. Muchas gracias por la intervención. Bueno, quería hacer un paréntesis. ¿Pueden quitar el aire acondicionado? Porque estamos todas prácticamente con el abrigo o el chal puesto, entonces, por favor.
Lo hemos pedido en reiteradas ocasiones. Llevamos 20 minutos pidiéndolo o más también.
Bueno, está gracias. Bien. Gracias. No, quería preguntar, muchas gracias por la intervención. Quería saber si en algún momento de este estudio se ha considerado la violencia contra las mujeres específicamente, porque por lo menos en el contexto catalán y español también es un eje fundamental de desigualdad.
Yes, thank you. I totally understand your question, and I consider it very important as well. So we don't have any definitive, it wasn't a definitive question for us in this study, but obviously we do have some information about it in relation to specific countries. For example, there's a chapter by Akvuko Emejulu and Lea Passel on France and the UK, and women who have ethnic minority backgrounds, and we see this increased level of violence against them as a result of the crisis. We were supposed to have a chapter on Greece by Maria Karamessini and Maria Stratikaki, and they are feminist scholars who are now very engaged in Athens, in the city politics. So they were supposed to write a chapter, and the question of violence against women and gender violence would have been central for this chapter on Greece. Because we do have, but we don't have it now, but we have it in all the Greek shadow reports to CEDAW, the UN reporting mechanism, which show the increased levels of really physical violence, domestic violence against women, but also on the public sphere. For example, increased levels of prostitution and violence against prostitutes. So I think it's a very important question. Also in Finland, and especially in the context of the Istanbul Convention, that this is the moment when the countries across Europe should be implementing the Istanbul Convention, which actually requires resources and money. And what kind of excuse is the austerity politics for not giving this money? But just to give you the answer about Finland, for example, so the Finnish government is definitely not implementing the Istanbul Convention very well, but they have managed to give some resources. This is one of the few issues where they have put some resources into in terms of the making the access to shelters better in line with the Istanbul Convention. But they are not being very effective otherwise. Finland, if you know the statistics in terms of domestic violence in Europe, Finland and Sweden come on the top. We have the most reported gender violence or domestic violence in Europe. And the policies are not in place and are not very good. I hope this answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have two questions which are a bit related. The first one is regarding the current discussion at the EU level on the European agenda on collaborative economy and how the guidelines and changes that might provide the regulation on the collaborative economy might impact on gender, or if gender has been considered. And the second one is regarding the ICT dimension generally, like how this the development of the digital economy and the ICT policies supported by the European Commission might have also had a gender impact or have had a gender component. Thank you.
These were so specific questions that I'm afraid I'm not, they are outside my area of expertise. So I'm afraid I can't answer them. I'm very, very sorry. But it reminded me of some other developments that I forgot to mention, also on the European level that I try to follow, which is the social rights pillar. I don't know if have you discussed it. Maybe you can, or I'd also like to share experiences about that. Because unlike some of these economic steering mechanisms, the European Commission has now put out the draft for the social rights pillar, and it's out for consultation. I hope that they have been here as well. They have been in Helsinki, and there you can actually see gender. So it's one of the few papers where gender is a central component and where gender has been mainstreamed. But now we get at this question about the visibility and the importance. So you mentioned some of a very kind of important strategies, and then we have the social rights pillar, which very few people are following, and very few people actually have faith in that it's going to have a strong impact. So that's something that I forgot to take up in this talk. But I'm sorry, I'm not able to talk about digitalization and the way that gender figures there, although I can definitely see the relevance of gender.
Quería preguntar, el hecho de que por primera vez, yo creo que en 30 y tantos años, la Unión Europea no tenga una estrategia de igualdad aprobada por un órgano político, sino, como has explicado, por un documento técnico, ¿qué consecuencias tiene, ¿no? Y también qué relación con el hecho de que por primera vez haya una comisaria que se llama de igualdad de género, cuando justamente las políticas de igualdad de género son más débiles.
Thank you. Yes, definitely. There's a colleague of mine, Petra Ahrens. She has actually written from Humboldt University, Berlin. One of our next speakers is from Berlin, and she has written a book about this. This shift in the European Commission from the framework strategies to this weaker steering mechanism. And according to her, Petra's research findings, it will have significant impact, especially in relation to kind of DGs that are more resistant towards gender equality, and towards in relation to member states that are more resistant towards gender equality, because the Commission's framework strategy has always been an important kind of a backbone. It's like in Finland, like even as scholars and activists, we can criticize some of these papers, but they're actually quite important for dedicated civil servants to fall back on and to say that, look, it's in this framework strategy, and it's very strongly here. And it can be used both at the Commission level and then at the member state level. So I think this is the significance when it's only a weaker communication to the staff and about a narrower range of questions. And your question had a second part in relation to this kind of a paradox. That we have a commissioner and then we have weaker policy. And I don't know if I have a very good answer for that. As such, I think questions around gender equality and gender equality policy are often paradoxical. And it's part of the kind of the power play that you can have a lot of window dressing and it can look good on a surface. But then you always have to dig under the surface and see what's going on. And then you might find the more depressing picture, which is related to some of the broader societal, political and economic trends that we are talking about today. Thank you.